China's new foreign policy prerogative, introduced by Xi Jinping earlier this year, speaks of initiative, determination, unity, the pursuit of achievement, and courage to fight. But Deng Zhanping's policy, which is still the overriding one, says to be quiet, to hide opportunities, to bide your time, to keep a low profile, and never to claim leadership. These two perspectives could not be more different, and Xi's new way of doing things signals a departure from lowbrow politics. Putin, meanwhile, is making waves in his own right. Shortly after Xi's new policy, Russia signed off on a $165 billion deal with China, which prescribes to develop at least 80 bilateral projects across Eurasia. The result is the creation of new pipelines, terminals, and trade corridors that bind China and Russia together and expand their hegemony in the periphery. Interestingly, it has long been thought that the Sino-Russian alliance carries too much baggage, too much history, and too many principles to be successful. But geopolitics is ever-changing, and when someone says you can't put a price on principles, well, then maybe the offer was just too low. Politicians play the cards they're dealt. In April 1997, a preceding meeting took place at the Kremlin. Boris Yeltsin hosted Jiang Zemin, and both jointly declared a commitment to a multipolar world without hegemony, condemning the monopolization of world affairs, presumably by the United States. But in the midst of a unipolar moment, there was little that could be done but to stay away from each other. Having abandoned domestic development and Central Asian expansion, China pursued a development strategy focused on export production, concentrated in coastal special economic zones. Russia, meanwhile, used its hydrocarbon wealth to complement Western industry by running a dozen gas pipelines to Europe. By 2011, the Russian-German Nord Stream project was launched, and a decade later, Europe was buying roughly half of its gas from Russia, 2/5 of Moscow's state revenues. However, this strategy of energy interdependence contradicted Moscow's on-the-ground goals. NATO and European encroachments on its borders generated tensions, especially over Ukraine. And in 2014, the overthrow of a pro-Russian government in Kiev prompted Moscow to annex Crimea and ignite a separatist conflict in the Donbass. Biden did not fall asleep at the wheel. He slapped sanctions on projects like Nord Stream 2, even threatening to end them entirely. In this, Biden found common cause with his East European counterparts, who feared geopolitical marginalization. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 led to increased sanctions, causing a temporary 67 billion euros trade deficit between Russia and Europe. But after Nord Stream was disrupted in September 2022, Russian gas supplies plummeted. And since Russia no longer had anything to link it to Europe, it began to replace its industry in the West with physical infrastructure directed toward China. Now, Moscow and Beijing are aiming for an annual trade turnover of $200 billion by 2024. Here, the first port of call is agriculture. Proposed in 2012, the new land grain corridor will connect Russian grain to Chinese markets, dodging the Black Sea route and reducing China's dependence on North American and Australian imports. The capital investment in the project is $6.5 billion, and it will carry 7 million tons of grain annually from the Russian Far East, the Urals region, and the Siberian Federal District. Most of this cargo will pass through the Zabaykalsk grain terminal, a railroad shipping complex on the border with Inner Mongolia, construction of which began in 2020. In response, Beijing is expanding automobile exports to Russia and cooperating in aircraft construction and scientific projects. However, the main focus of integration is energy policy. Chinese demand will absorb Russian supply. At the head of this operation is the Power of Siberia pipeline. Overseen by Gazprom and the China National Petroleum Corporation, the Power of Siberia pipeline runs along the Chinese coast through Beijing to Shanghai. Gas deliveries will begin in 2019 and will be halved during 2022. The southern expansion will start in 2025. Meanwhile, in 2024, the construction of the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline connecting the gas fields of the Yamal Peninsula via Mongolia to China will begin. This pipeline will provide an outlet for gas from fields previously serving Europe, making it a direct substitute for Nord Stream. If all goes to plan, by 2030, Russian gas exports to China will hit 98 billion cubic meters, along with 100 million tons of LNG. Besides energy surging, Bilateral trade has also accelerated de-dollarization. Cross-border transactions are increasingly settled in yuan. By the end of 2022, yuan trading in rubles exceeded dollar transactions on some days. Moscow's pivot to friendly currencies resulted in the yuan's share of trade on Russian currency markets rising from 1 to 45%, while trade in the dollar was cut in half, from 80% to 40%. In March 2023, exports from Central Asia increased by more than half, with the bulk tied to investments in energy, minerals, and rail transport. These investments include a new railroad from Kashgar to Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, complementing the Middle Corridor. Beijing's policy in Central Asia will focus on trade, investment, tourism, and cultural exchange. In addition, the plan is related to security cooperation. It appears to be a hedge against residual Turkic anxieties about China's controversial actions in Xinjiang. Still more, Chinese lawmakers look to fast-track Line D of the China Central Asia Pipeline, a project that turned Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan into some of China's largest gas suppliers. For context, in 2022, the combined value of Chinese-bound Kazakh and Turkmen trade surpassed $100 billion collectively. Central Asia represents a lucrative market, and China plans to impress it. But as the rubber meets the road, China and Russia have also begun to support each other's regional ambitions. Whereas before, the Russians would ignore America's Asia-Pacific alliances and the Chinese would brush off American policymaking in Europe, now Moscow and Beijing have developed more sympathy and understanding towards one another. Take the AUKUS alliance as an example. The $370 billion program to arm Australia with nuclear-powered submarines is ostensibly aimed at China. Moscow opposes the pact as part of Western efforts to encircle Eurasia via interlocking groupings like NATO, ANZUS, Five Eyes, and Quad. To this end, China and Russia have responded with their own alphabet soup arrangement, including RCEP and CUSO. Another example of shared regional ambitions is Beijing piggybacking its Arctic ambitions onto Russia, which boasts substantial ports and other assets in the Arctic Circle. The North Pole is projected to be ice-free by 2050, challenging seafloor resources including oil, gas, and uranium. For China, this also means new sea routes that could cut shipping times in half. But be that as it may, there are still flies in the ointment. Though geopolitics is tying Russia and China together, there have been minimal soft power inroads. China's cultural and media influence in Russia remains low-key. Although Russia's coverage of China is generally favorable, the lack of real influence means that warm relations could quickly cool if bilateral relations deteriorate. Such tensions could arise from China's penetration into Central Asia or its increasing influence in Vladivostok. The new bilateral agreement, effective June 2023, aims to promote the development of Jilin province by allowing goods bound for Zhuhai to pass through Vladivostok without tariffs. But Chinese nationalists have long coveted this city, which was annexed by the Russians under an unequal treaty in 1858. And as the demographic and economic scales in the region tilt more and more toward China, this could raise Russian concerns about irritivism. But for the moment, each side is content to burn that bridge when they come to it. In the grand scheme of things, Russia's European aspirations are dead, but its Asian aspirations have been given new life. Its partnership of convenience with China is evolving into one of necessity, and like all healthy marriages, it has been enabled by strategic concessions in Central Asia and the Far East. Although some call Russia China's junior partner, its sheer size, wealth of resources, and nuclear arsenal will allow it to retain much of its political autonomy. Not all of it, but enough. And that is bargain Russia is willing to make. Because since politics is the world's second oldest profession, it closely resembles the first. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching this video to the end. See you in the next videos.